When do you use an appositive in a sentence? Well, basically, appositives are used to clarify the meaning of a sentence. Hi, I'm Paige Carrera. Happy writing. Appositives sound like they're kind of complicated, but they're really not. Let's go ahead and take a look at a sentence here. I've got a couple examples for you here. The night Sir Arthur Black guarded the castle. Well, this is pretty easy. Appositives are separated by commas, so you can tell that Sir Arthur Black, separated by the commas here, is the appositive. It's basically clarifying the knight that guarded the castle. Appositives, if you take them out of the sentence, this main sentence can still survive on its own. We have another example here too. Amy went to Costa Rica, comma, an island in Central America. Now, Amy went to Costa Rica can survive on its own, but we have an appositive, an island in Central America, that just gives you clarification on where Amy went, where the island is located, and it just helps to make more sense. Putting the appositive between commas, it sets it off from the subject of the sentence, and when you're speaking the sentence, you would pause right after the word night and again after the word black. So you want to make sure you give pause where you're supposed to when you're reading the sentence, and especially when you're reading it out loud. Notice you can remove the appositive from the sentence once again, and it will still make sense. Again, think about it as a modifier to what's really going on here. Also, just one last tip, appositives can't stand alone. Think about them as adjectives to what's going on in the sentence. You take this out, the knight guarded the castle, can still survive on its own. I hope this helps you more with appositives in your writing. Happy writing. I'm Paige Carrera.
It is a great time to be alive because today we're talking about subject-verb agreement. Now, subjects and verbs have to agree, which is just a fancy way of saying that they have to sound right together. And you're probably used to this in its most basic form. For instance, subject-verb agreement explains why you say, by noon, I am always starving, but you say, by noon, Grace is always starving. Subject-verb agreement is the idea that the subject determines how the verb sounds or conjugates. Now, of course, it's going to be much trickier than I am and Grace is on the SAT, and you'll have to watch out for subject-verb agreement on two major question types, identifying errors and improving sentences. Now, like I said, it gets much trickier, so let's go into depth now. Now, just a second ago, I gave you an easy example of subject-verb agreement, I am, and also Grace is. Now, the reason it's so easy is that the subject and the verb are next to each other. I is next to am, Grace is next to is. Now, the way the SAT makes these subject-verb agreement problems tougher is by moving the subject and the verb further apart. And they do it in two ways right here. So, in order to see whether the subject and the verb on the SAT sound right together, you're going to have to ignore these two things, these things that are keeping the subject and the verb apart. So they are extra information between commas and prepositional phrases. And each of these is pretty detailed, so we're going to take time to go in depth with each of them, starting with extra information between commas. First of all, what does this mean, extra information between commas? You know you're dealing with extra information between commas if you could use parentheses or long dashes in place of the pair of commas. Let me show you what that looks like. Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, made history in 1983. Now, the first American woman in space is going to be quote-unquote extra information between commas because I could also write it with parentheses and I could also write it with long dashes. Now, these probably won't appear on the SAT, but they're just ways of thinking about how this is extra information being thrown your way. Now, because it's extra information, you're going to be able to ignore it when looking for subject-verb agreement. Let's look at an example here. My father, who has sung backup for dozens of solo artists and bands, are truly talented. So we have extra information between commas here. And I know that because I could ignore the commas and put this between parentheses, like my father, who has sung backup for dozens of solo artists and bands, are truly talented, or I could also put them between long dashes. Now, I'm not suggesting that you actually need to go around drawing long dashes and parentheses on the SAT. I'm just saying it's a way of checking if this is extra information. So, if you know it's extra information by applying this little test, you can ignore it for the purposes of subject-verb agreement. Let me show you. What's left is a nice short sentence where the subject and the verb are adjacent again. So we're back to that situation like I am or Grace is. We have, my father are truly talented. Now, you probably already knew the sentence was wrong, but now it's even more obvious. My father are should definitely be my father is. So sure enough, here's the final answer. My father, who has sung backup for dozens of solo artists and bands, is truly talented. Let's look at a couple more examples, and they'll get a little more subtle. The warnings, which were outlined in the government